questions and you want answers. Welcome to the Q&A show.
Yes, a big welcome to the Q&A show. It's live, it's Thursday night, and it's going to be for 90 minutes. We've extended it because people are just saying we're not having enough time to get through all the emails and the texts that people are writing in. So tonight I do a special guest, and I've also got Mark the Cabbie, our very favourite. Do you know, you are so popular, it's incredible. And your knowledge is incredible too.
I know, yeah. And I don't know plenty much more. So,
okay, well,
yeah, there you go.
That's great. So my guest tonight is Zalmi Unsdorfer.
How do you do?
How do you do? Good.
Nice to be here.
Do you know, I've got to say a big thank you to you before you even start, because we've only had about 2 sentences that we've been able to speak with each other before the show. So I'm just as in the dark as our viewers are about who you are, what you are doing, and just want to know more about you.
Okay.
So Zalmi, just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, I'm a Londoner, family man, businessman. My father was a survivor of the Auschwitz concentration camp. Most of that side of the family were wiped out in the Holocaust. And I kind of discovered my Zionism through the prism of the Holocaust and being a son of a survivor. It was, I think, when I went to Poland to see the flypast of the Israeli Air Force over the concentration camp that actually fired me up. I'm an Orthodox Jew. My first appointment every day is with God, 7 o'clock every morning. So I'm very committed in that respect. And I get to Israel. I spend a lot of time in Israel, and I try to be in Jerusalem about every 6 weeks to recharge my batteries. And that's really my story, and I'm happy to talk about topics that relate to Israel.
Fantastic. Well, with our viewers, the majority of them are so understanding about the history of Israel and the challenges over the centuries, really, that the Jews have had in finding a place where they could call home, really, for a start off. And also all the things which are quite complicated for the average person who looks at the situation in the Middle East would just sort of think, what is the problem? Why can't the Palestinians and the Jews get along together? Or, you know, did the Jews come along and just push the Palestinians out? And they don't understand really the sort of symmetry and everything else that goes back to the times of Abraham, Ishmael and Isaac. And I think that's needs a real revelation for people and an understanding as to why there are problems in the Middle East today that cannot be solved probably by political means.
That's because, unfortunately, the Arabs have been pawns for most of their resistance. Power is all that counts, you know, in the Middle East. I was last weekend in Hebron for the anniversary of, or the weekly portion that is read in Jewish synagogues. Last week was the story of Sarah and the death of Sarah, and Abraham went to Hebron to buy a burial site for her. So this week, every year, I go to Hebron with tens of thousands of Jews who flood Hebron just to be there, where the Torah reading of that particular time. Now, Hebron used to be an oasis of coexistence between Arabs and Jews. One night in 1929, the Mufti of Jerusalem gave out some announcement that the Jews were going to be taking over the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And so the same people who were babysitting for the Jewish people and the same Jews who were caring for the Arabs, you know, Jewish doctors caring for Arab patients and so forth, they lived together in harmony. The Arabs came out that night with machetes and axes, and they slaughtered 70 Jews in one night, just because they were used as tools. Yeah. And the same tools are being used in Gaza today. The Gaza people are being used by Hamas. So it's the same story until they break out of that thrall, until they stop becoming, you know, allowing themselves to be cannon fodder, being sent to the border, you know, human shields and all of that kind of thing. It's not going to change.
You mentioned a few things here that I'd just like to pick up with, and that's Hebron itself. Was that not King David's first abode?
King David was crowned in Hebron and spent his first 7 years of his dynasty was in Hebron. And I was, walking in areas where there were artifacts of his reign dug up from in the foundations of buildings there. It's just quite fascinating to see, really.
Wow. And the other thing that for me, because I'm learning all the time about Israel's history, it'll take me a lifetime, I'm sure, to even get half of what I should be knowing. But one thing that struck me when I read the scriptures is that King David was given an opportunity to be gifted the threshing floor of the Jebusite, which we now know is where the temple was originally built, Solomon's temple. And it was also, ironically, the same site as where Abraham was going to offer up Isaac.
Yes.
And so there's a real spiritual connection to that particular site, which is connected with Zion, isn't it, as well?
Yes, it's the Temple Mount.
Yeah.
Yes.
So when David, I thought he was very shrewd. When the Jebusite said to him, I want to give this to you, he said, no, I want to buy it. And he didn't buy it at a knockdown price. He paid a real good market price. And I think, for me, that was, he was just making sure that he was establishing an historical site for worship of the true God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob.
Yes, and that is actually, it's exactly the same as what Abraham did in Hebron. When he bought the cave of Machpelah, he paid 400 pieces of silver, and it's repeated in that section many times, and the cave and the field that went with it that he bought for 400 pieces of silver. And then when the other patriarchs and matriarchs were buried later on in the Bible, every time they mentioned the name of Machpelah, where they took these patriarchs and matriarchs to be buried, they referred again in the cave which Abraham bought for 400 pieces of silver. And do you know why it's repeated so many times? Because God knew that the Arabs and the other peoples of the world would say, you stole this. This isn't yours.
Right.
Israel, you've stolen that too.
Yeah.
Okay, so...
and I think the same with, the Mount Zion, because David bought it. He paid the price for it, and a high price. So, but why is it then that the world doesn't really see this as really a more, let me put it phrase it another way. The world seems to look at the Jews coming back and taking the land in 1948 and becoming a state, as if that was the first time they'd ever come into the land. Why do they not look at the history going back, 3,000 years to the time of Abraham?
Well, unfortunately, this is the success of Palestinian propaganda. They're putting this narrative out, and they shout louder than everybody else. And they don't just shout louder than anyone else with Pallywood and all of the things all the fake propaganda and so forth that goes forward. The same thing happens on campus. Today, if a pro-Jewish lecturer or an Israeli ambassador or someone who is anti the BDS movement happens to come along, they don't listen to him, or they don't actually argue with him, they're just going to shout over him. And that's really how it works. He who shouts the loudest.
Right, but this is interesting because, Mark, at any time you want to ask any questions, because it's quite fascinating to have someone like yourself in the studio, and again, our audience as well, live@revelationtv.com is the email address, and the SMS number will come up on your screen throughout the program. Do ask questions to Zalmi that you want to know more about Israel, and particular points like which we're talking about here, so that you could fully understand the history and why perhaps you're in the dark on certain things and you'd like to be enlightened. Not being condescending there, I don't mean that at all in that way. But I found it fascinating. I only really knew about the history of Israel by reading the scriptures. I was 21, and the first book I'd ever read in my life, because I'm dyslexic, was this book. And it took me 2¼ years. But I learned, and because I started at Genesis, not the New Testament, I learned so much.
Yes.
about the history of Israel, and I was so fascinated. I mean, I got in a van. I organised it all, and I drove to Israel. I know you had to go through
a bit of water.
Yeah, to get to Haifa. But I just loved what I was reading here, and I was just so excited to get to Israel. And I spent 3 months there, and I was on a kibbutz as a 33-year-old. You know, just loved it. But I had to read the Bible to get initiated, as it were, into the truth of Israel. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, what would you say to people today who, you know, want to start a journey of learning more about Israel? What would you say is the best way to do this?
Well, certainly the biblical way is, it's like reading a tour guide's book. At the end of the day, you go to places in Israel which are grounded and steeped in biblical history. And you don't even have to dig underneath the ground. I mean, if you dig underneath the ground, you're going to find, you know, Jewish artifacts all the time. But just by being in places, you know, and following what Scripture says, and they journeyed from here and they stopped in here. I mean, there's, you know, the whole of the chapter of the tribes and the journeys, right? Matot and Maseh, as we call them. Is they stopped here and they encamped here, and they stopped here and they encamped there, and you have all those names and all those cities, and those villages and wadis are all in the Bible. You know, but the other side of the equation, take it out of the biblical way and bring it into today, there is so much libel and so much falsehood which is spoken about Israel, that, you know, people who read the New York Times or mainstream media and so forth will imagine, my goodness, this is a war zone. You know, there's Arabs, you know, rioting all over the place. It's not safe to go on a bus or on a restaurant and so on and so forth. You know, I'm there every 5-6 weeks. I can tell you that in many cases I feel a lot safer there than I do on the London streets, where they're not checking you and there's no stop and search and so forth. And it's and there they know their terrorism there. They know what to look for, and they've actually got it down to a fine art. But you know, it's a country which is vibrant. The cities are vibrant. You know, Tel Aviv is the most, you know, multicultural and multi-ethnic and multi-gendered city in, you know, probably in the world. In terms of Tel Aviv, actually is considered to be the most pluralistic city in the world. Not all the Jews in Jerusalem, the religious Jews in Jerusalem, you know, approve of that necessarily, but it's wonderful. You know, it is a vibrant democracy, an open, pluralistic society, which we have there. And just down the street, you know, they're throwing people off the building if they don't conform, and they're sending them to the border, you know, to throw rocks and missiles so that the Israelis can't fire back. So I think if people go by themselves, see for yourself. There's nothing like seeing it for yourself. Which
is what I did all those years ago. One of the things I think would help people to come to a better understanding about the relationship between Jew and Arab is that I've witnessed and I've talked to Arabs and Palestinians, if there's a difference, that where they have they currently live in peace and harmony, and they work for Jewish organisations or whatever, but there isn't this animosity amongst some of the ones that I've actually met. Have you got good relations with Arabs yourself?
Very much so, very much so. I go to restaurants in Israel, in Jerusalem. I go in taxis. I go into stores. You know, my supermarket is run by an Arab. We're talking about obviously Arab Israelis, and you know, 20% of these population of Israel is Arab Israelis, and they have full rights just like the Israelis do.
They're in the parliament as well, the Knesset?
Yes, correct. They're represented in the Knesset. I mean, I must say, I'm not so happy that some of their representatives lionize terrorists when they are, you know, when they're in their mourning tents, they go and visit. You know, I don't agree with that, but they play a very important part in a vibrant society, and they're doctors. If you go up to the Hadassah hospital, Mount Scopus, you'd think that you are in Arabia.
Yeah.
And you go to the Hebrew University, it's almost totally, you know, overflowing with Arab students. One hopes that they will do extremely well and become integrated and become professors and doctors and scientists and so forth, and thereby encourage their brethren in, you know, in the West Bank, as they call it. We call it Judea and Samaria, and in Gaza, to become proper citizens and build a society instead of building rocket bases.
Wow. Do you know how one thing that pops in my mind is, from what Zalmi was saying, the Lord said it about a strong delusion at the end of times, and I believe that the biggest delusion on this earth at the moment is concerning God's people, the Jews, and his land. You know, it's almost as if, you know, I listen to radio all day, LBC, very rational, very intelligent, very erudite people, journalists. As soon as a mention of the Jews, Israel come on, almost like the same as with Donald Trump, it's almost like they become obsessed and oppressed by a lying spirit, you know. It really is, you know, even throwing accusations that it's an apartheid state and comparing it to South Africa in the bad old days, you know. I mean, it's actually laughable. It is actually laughable.
Well, we've got quite a few emails and texts come in. We try this one. This is from Jack and Julian. Thank you for writing in.
Oh, that's my son.
Is it?
That's my son.
Oh, my goodness.
And his friend in Germany, yeah.
Oh, right.
Hello,
who's ex-Muslim.
And Julian is an ex-Muslim, yeah.
Yeah, so it's quite interesting.
Yeah, brilliant.
Become a Christian. We are strong Zionists and supporters of Israel, and although we're not obliged to support all the political decisions of the nation of Israel, it does seem that Israel, over the decades, has acted righteously in its dealings with Arab nations and the Palestinians. However, we do not know much about the so-called Nakba. Did Israel treat the local Arabs violently and with malice, or is it another lie? Please, can you explain what happened during the so-called, am I pronouncing this right? Nakba?
Yes.
Yeah. Was that the day of disaster?
Nakba, yes. Nakba means disaster.
Yeah.
And Nakba is the name which is given by the Palestinian, or the PLO movement, to the Israeli Independence Day. So in 1948, when Israel declared its independence, it was a great day for Israel, a great day for the Jewish people. And they called it a disaster for themselves. If we're talking about being badly treated, well, I assume that your questioner is talking about the war, which was then waged by 7 Arab armies on the nascent Jewish state to kill the Jewish state in its crib. And the answer to that is that no, we didn't treat them badly at all. In fact, it was the Arabs who basically told people to leave their homes, and that they would be coming back to inherit all the Jewish homes.
Yeah.
And you know, at the end of the day, I think I can quote Richard Kemp when he says that, you know, the IDF is the most moral army in the history of military warfare in terms of the way it avoids civilian casualties. And I'm pretty sure it was the same in 1948 as it is now.
Yeah.
The Arabs were given an opportunity to stay, weren't they? Yes. And they chose to, I suppose, go after the carrot of their inheriting not only the Jewish homes as well, but all the land. Yes. So they took a gamble there, and it didn't pay off really.
Well, you know, the Arabs don't take gambles. They have all these things done for them by the Muslim Brotherhood, by, like I mentioned, the Mufti of Jerusalem at that time. You know, the bottom line is, and for as long as they will be pawns to, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood and Iran, for example.
Yep.
I mean, the bottom line is everything you see going on in Gaza today, every piece of misery that you see in Gaza today is orchestrated by Iran, by its money and by its jihadist agenda.
Yeah.
There's no question about it. Without Iran, there would be no Hamas. Without Hamas, then the greenhouses which were left in Gush Katif, which was the settlements in the Gaza area, which were gifted by
which were viable as well.
Viable greenhouses that were given over to these people intact. Hamas destroyed them and turned them into rocket bases.
Yeah.
You know, it's criminal.
Now, why would they do that? I know the answer, but just for some of our viewers, why would Hamas actually ruin that environment from being, you know, something that was viable and people could have been able to earn a living from those greenhouses?
Well, the leaders of Hamas are mostly millionaires, but multi-millionaires. I mean, if you look up Google and you put in Hamas millionaires or billionaires, you'll find the whole story there. I don't have to tell you that story. So they depend on smuggling tunnels. They depend on the money that they get from Iran. They control, everything from cigarettes to fuel to desalinated water and so forth, all of that. And they depend on the corruption. And the only way in which you can maintain this corruption is to have a subdued people, to have a people who do not know their rights, the people who are uneducated, people who are brainwashed in madrasas. And unfortunately, the UN has also been very complicit in this. UNRWA has perpetuated this refugee status.
Yeah.
And fortunately, I'm very happy that Donald Trump has restricted their funding, and hopefully they will wither on the vine. And it's important that I would quote, in air quotes, Arab refugees, because I don't think that they are refugees,
yeah.
Should be resettled like every other refugee in the history of the world.
Yeah. I read the other day, Howard, that the UN have granted the Palestinian refugees the status of being refugees, even your progeny, even the people that were born after you. Officially, there's about 30,000, I read, actual true refugees that are still alive, but now apparently it adds up to about 5 million.
It is, that's exactly
right. And the whole plan is, if you keep saying they have got the rights to return, the offspring, if you bring 5 million people back, end of Jewish state. It's subtle, but it's dangerous.
Yeah, the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, controls refugees all over the world. Turkey, Syria, all of them are all under UNHCR. And under the charter of the UN Refugee Agency, the job is to resettle them. But for the Palestinians, a special UNRWA was created. Different status, far more resources per refugee, something like 20 times the resources per refugee is given to a Palestinian refugee than to a Turkish or Syrian or Yazidi or whatever refugee. And they perpetuate, as you say, this refugee crisis. So if UNRWA were disbanded and all the Palestinian refugees became under the UNHCR, they would automatically then dissipate and be resettled like all other refugees.
Yeah.
Right. Must get through some more of these texts and emails as well. This is from Eddie. Says, the Quran teaches that the Jews are the fiercest enemies of the Muslims, 582. And does your guest believe that there can be peace in the Middle East as long as Muslims accept the Quran as divine revelation?
Well, there are Muslims and Muslims. There are Islamists and jihadists and Salafists and Wahhabists and so forth. Okay, the vast majority of Muslims are great people. They integrate with society. Unfortunately, there is a percentage which is generally regarded as somewhere between 15 and 20%, which subscribe to Sharia law and the more extreme bases. So I have faith in the majority. However, the fact of the matter is that all the world's conflicts and all of the killings that have gone on, the mass murders and the Holocaust and so forth, were done by the minority, and not the majority. The majority were the people who stood idly by. And unfortunately, speaking as a Jew, I have very good friends who are Muslims. In fact, I have one that calls me pretty much every day. He's one of the leading authorities on halal in this country. I happen to have a business relationship. I helped him out with something once. But he calls me every Friday and he wishes me Shabbat Shalom and I wish him, Juma Mubarak. And, they're great people. But unfortunately, they don't get up in the streets and demonstrate against the jihadists. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to see more of that.
Yes, we all would. And I think, as David writes in here, I think it's quite appropriate right now to ask you this. What message of hope do you have for the Palestinians in Gaza or in the West Bank?
I think I think one of the best hopes is Donald Trump, because he's stifling the flow of funds. As long as money keeps flowing from Europe and from America to the PLO, which has really never changed from being a terrorist organization, it's Arafat and a tie. That's Abbas, really. As long as the money keeps flowing, then these corrupt and vicious leaders will continue to abuse the Palestinian, we call them the Palestinians really are the Jews. There are Palestinian Arabs, but if you talk about who are the Palestinians, the Jews are the Palestinians. Because before 1948, 1948, Israel was created, but before that, it was called Palestine. Why was it called Palestine? Because it used to be called Judea. Judea was invaded by the Romans, and they minted the coin, which said Judea capta, we've captured Judea, and then they renamed Judea Palestine. So this whole Palestinian narrative is a complete fiction, but there are Palestinian Arabs, i.e. Arabs who lived in Palestine.
Yeah, as there are with the Jews.
And now they are Arab Israelis.
Yeah. Okay, so, well, the next question is, what do you think about President Trump? I mean, you've obviously mentioned that you think Trump is actually doing some really good things at the moment, especially stifling the funds. What about also the embassy being in Jerusalem?
I'm a huge fan of Donald Trump because he is not politically correct. I think PC is killing the whole world today, making us deny what is happening in front of our eyes in so many respects. I have enormous gratitude to him for confirming the glory of Jerusalem before the eyes of the world.
Yes.
He's a man who has under-promised and over-delivered in so many respects. And I pray that he will go through a full second term. Yeah. And I think, actually, to be perfectly frank, there is an old expression which you know very well, and I will bless those that bless you, and I will curse those that curse you.
Yeah. Genesis 12.
And Trump, 12, yes. And I'm not sure that President Obama was terribly blessed for what he did to Israel, especially in the last days of his presidency, basically throwing Israel under the bus at the United Nations. But President Trump has been enormously supportive, and I believe that he has divine help.
Do you think he's a little bit of a Cyrus?
Well,
you see a sort of similarity?
Well, yeah, you know, at the end of the day, I think he is a man of faith, and that's kind of rare. You know, the Democrat Party at their previous convention, they wanted to take God out of the opening ceremony. Yeah. They had some, you know, they wanted to take God out of it. Yeah. So I think we're dealing in a world where between the godless and the ones with faith.
It's that clear, isn't it, Zalmi? It's a real dividing line.
It is 100% that clear.
And at the end of the day, President Trump's only done what a whole list of consecutive American presidents decided to do.
Including Obama, apparently. Including
Obama. They all agreed that they would, at some time, whenever that time would be to move the embassy.
Yes.
And he just did what he said.
Because the others were scared of the Arab boycott. Yes. And this has been really, this whole thing since 1967, we know, with the airplane hijackings and all the things that went on with the PLO and the oil embargoes. This has been a protection racket for years. This is the biggest protection racket.
Yeah.
You know, if you support us, if you pull your punches on Israel and you support our narrative, then you won't have terrorism on your doorstep, and you won't have
almost
oil explosion. Yeah, it is.
Protectionism. Yeah.
Let's face it.
Let me. I mean, what comes to mind again as well? Why not? Why does the world not want to recognise Jerusalem? And that sounds like a naive question coming up, but as the capital of Israel, why do you think they don't want to? Because when you look at history, it has every reason that should be the place. Is it purely to pacify the Palestinians?
Yes, it's all politics. And besides which, you know, the bottom line is, how many votes are there in Israel? How many votes are there in supporting the Jews? You know, I'm always very, very surprised when I see a non-Jew in a high position. supporting Israel, because he risks opprobrium and he risks not being invited to the cocktail parties and so forth. I have an insane story with Colonel Richard Kemp, because I heard Richard Kemp years ago speaking at Geneva, and I'm pretty sure you all both know the speech that he gave.
I can't remember.
No,
It
It was after it was the Goldstone report, and he appeared in Geneva and gave evidence to the United Nations in Geneva, saying that Israel is the most moral army. That's the quote I gave you earlier on.
Yeah.
And I remember watching that clip and asking myself, what is a British colonel? Because the British army and, the Israelis, there's old stuff from 1948 and the ships being turned away from Haifa. There wasn't a great situation.
No.
What is a British colonel doing standing up for Israel? What does he get for it? Does he get money for it? Does he get kudos for it? All he's going to get is a
risk.
He's never going to get promotion in the British Army. He's never going to get, he's never going to be lauded in Fleet Street by the media. He's not going to get any awards. I wonder why. I remember saying to him, I wonder what bad dream this man had that he said a thing like this. And many years later, I was on a flight from Tel Aviv, and there was Richard Kemp in the opposite aisle. And I went up to him and I said,
why?
Do you know, I want to shake your hand for what you said in Geneva years ago. I really appreciate it. My people appreciate it. He says, I only did this for what was in my heart. So we exchanged cards, and I got home, and it was an email from him. And he said, very nice to meet you. By any chance, would you be the son of the S.B. Unsdorfer who wrote The Yellow Star, my father's memoir of Auschwitz?
Yeah.
And I said, yeah, but that's been out of print for 50 years. How do you know about it? He said, I read it when I was a teenager, and it had the most profound effect on me of anything I've read about the Jewish people. And I got my answer as to why he stood up in Geneva. And that's an astonishing story.
Yeah. I think what, for me as well, I was only probably 8 years old, 10 years old, and we just bought a television at home. And I saw the documentaries on Auschwitz and the other camps. And I said to my parents, I said, how did you let this happen?
Even at that age? Even at your age?
Yes.
That was how
that had a profound effect as a child. And so all the way through those years, and that's why when I read the scriptures as a young person, 21, I was fascinated in the history, right? And I was starting to get to an understanding why the Jews were always persecuted wherever they went, and but I know the end story. That's the great thing, and I thought most of our viewers do too, and especially the blessings and the curses, if otherwise as well. But one of my great ancestors was Colonel Claude Rainier Conder. He was in the British Army along with Lord Kitchener. They were friends at university, and they were in the army together. And he was used mightily as a cartographer, first of all, also as one who is looking for archaeological digs, and he founded one of the stones, like one of the cornerstones in the temple, all sorts of things. But he more or less gave his life really for trying to help Israel to be recognized in the world as the rightful owners really of the land. And it was just amazing. And there were other people throughout in history who stood up, like Lord Balfour and other people, great men of God, I would say, as well, who've recognised from scriptures that the land belongs to the Jews. And it's at great cost. I mean, Revelation TV has been an advocate. And I remember before I launched Revelation TV, having this interview, very short interview, press interview with Benjamin Netanyahu. And I was so nervous, really nervous. And it was about 1999. It was 1999. And I was trying to get out of doing this, but my friend, who's a BBC cameraman, was saying, no, Howard, just keep going. And we sat in this place where Benjamin was going to come in. And And I got moved from the front seat because there was more important people to come. And I said, yes, oh, that's great. Let me get to the back. And Tom was going, you can't do that. We came here, you sit. I said, Tom, I'm quite happy. I don't really want to meet him. You know, so, and he comes in the back. A typical sort of, you know, you spoil the normal way of coming and entering just for security reasons. And I'm writing a note down, trying to write something. I'm praying. Give me a question that I can ask him that's going to, you know, sort of spur us on for years. And this hand came down in front of me, and I looked up. It was Netanyahu, and he's shaking my hands, and In the end, when eventually everybody poured out and pushed me out the way, which I was quite happy with, my cameraman's still pushing me forward. And it was like, what happened next is Benjamin comes up to me and he says, who are you? I mean, he was interviewing me. He's like, I'm trying to get away from, let all the crowd, everybody else do it. And I uttered a question, and very nervously. And then eventually I got what I wanted, which has spurred me on for these last 15 years, and that is, what can we do as Christians to help the Jewish people? And he said, establish the truth.
Oh.
He said, all the things that have happened over history have started by a web of lies. And he said, if you can just really, more or less, educate people, and this, I didn't know God was going to give me a channel to do it, because I'm literate, I'm not really well educated, but I had a really hard and an understanding that there was something not right in the ways in which the Jews have been treated. And that doesn't mean to say I don't have a heart for the Arab and the Palestinians. It means that just that what is truth is what is written in history and where we are today. And for the last 16 years, Zalmi, that's all I've done with this channel. And we've got a very small audience, but it's an audience that has learned so much. And we brought so many people to Israel. I mean, the first time I mentioned on air, you know, anybody want to come to Israel with me? And it was in the second Intifada at the time. And everybody's going, no, it's not very safe, it's not very safe. It's the safest place in the world, I said. Yes. Right now, if you're worried about terrorism, I said, the Jews have got it all under control, you know, and we're in God's land. Anyway, so I left it to Tim Vince to organise. And because I was spinning so many plates in those days to keep the channel on the air. And then I turn up at the airport, and
there's people.
They're all looking, and I'm thinking, who are they? There must be somebody famous behind me. And I looked behind me, there was nobody there. It was the Stansted Airport.
Okay.
First time I'd ever been there, and I wasn't used to the. And there was this line of people, and then they had such lovely smiles. I was thinking, and then they looked at me, and and I went, oh my God, all those people. There were 720 people. We had 3 aeroplanes full of people that wanted to come to Israel. And it was the beginning of part of, I feel like, the big education and also the thrill of going to Israel with so many people. And it was just amazing. We've done that, not as much as we should, but because we're trying to run the station as well.
Yes.
But it's been a fascinating time, and really, also I was in Poland 2 years ago, playing football with some colleagues that we had arranged to play some football matches out there. And I thought, I'm so near Auschwitz, I've got to go. And I only had a little GoPro camera. I didn't even have a handle for it. And I took that into the camp and I took it around with me. And I tell you, it affected me so much. I made that little 10-minute.
I remember,
it's a powerful little video that I put together. And, again, when you see how and what happened there, it's like we could end up being in a situation where we again could see anti-Semitism rise to such a point. And I read scriptures, Zalmi, and I'm sure you know them too, because they're Zechariah, where it talks about that God will have to step in chapters 12 through 14, because the nations will come against Jerusalem, and particularly because it's in Jewish hands.
Yes, yes. I was in Jerusalem for the festival of Sukkot, which is Tabernacles, which is where that particular piece of Zechariah is read on the festival.
Oh, okay.
The story about the 2 mountains and so forth. yeah, you know, at the end of the day, or end of days, that's what's happening. But you have to be blind, deaf, and dumb not to look at what's happened since 1948 in Israel and everything that's followed to deny that this is part of a divine plan here. This is the return, the ingathering of the exiles, and everything that is written.
You see that, you recognize that.
I see it, and I see it all the time, and I totally believe in it. We saw, you know, open miracles in 1967.
Yeah, we did.
And open miracles in 1973. And you know, nobody tells about those miracles better than Christian TV. I mean, I was watching one the other day about Colonel Effie Etam, who was one of those people who discovered his religion. He became religious after his experience in 1973. And fascinating stories of these people, what they saw. You know, thousands of tanks flying over, coming over the ridge, and then suddenly stopping for no reason. Why did they stop?
Wow.
You know? So, yeah.
Right, Howard, you mentioned about, you know, you being dyslexic and not being a learned man, but God had put it on your heart. And it just reminds me of 1 Samuel 16:7, that God does not look on the outward appearance, but upon the heart of man. And this whole Israel thing, let me put it like that, is a God-given revelation, really. I didn't know how to spell the word Israel 23 years ago, and then I came into the kingdom and the Lord put it on my heart. It is a supernatural revelation that what God says in that book is true. He says what he means what he says. And, you know, God delights in using people of lower means.
Yeah.
You know,
well, he says he
does.
Confounds the wise
He
by
does.
picking the simple, really.
Absolutely.
Yeah, look at the perfect example is Moses.
Yes.
You know, go speak to Pharaoh, but I can't speak properly. Maybe he was
Well, that's
also
why I'm a
dyslexic,
little bit
you
like
know.
that as well.
Yeah.
But you know, what is so amazing for me is that, again, the scriptures, they educated me. And I'm sure you're probably aware that in the New Testament, and this is what I was reading on my own. Nobody was influencing me at all. And I think it was probably the second time I'd read these particular scriptures, and because you gain a little bit more insight and you start to put it together like a little bit of a jigsaw puzzle. You know, you don't quite understand what this meant in Chronicles maybe, and then when you get to somewhere else, like Jeremiah or Isaiah, and then you get to even Luke or Acts or whatever, and then suddenly these things start to piece together and you can start to see the full picture. I came across, I think it was Romans 10 and 11. Just remind myself, yeah. And I read this in the rendition of the Bible that I was reading at the time. It said, "This is a sacred secret." Now, normally when you're reading, the mind gets full of other things, get distracted, and you're reading, but you're not really taking it in. Look, that's what I was able to discern from my own time of reading. And I thought, what was that I just read? This is a sacred secret. What is? And I looked at it. Did God reject the Jews? Never. I'm an Israelite. This is the Apostle Paul talking. A descendant of Abraham, the tribe of Benjamin. God did not reject his people whom he foreknew, and etc. And in fact, gets to the point where it more or less rebukes Christians for, look, don't become haughty and thinking that you're it. You've somehow superseded the Jews. You've taken over. You know, the church has taken over from the Jews. Because he says that I've given them, you know, a blindness in part for a time. But then when you, as a Gentile, you will be grafted in. He said, I could chop you off. I could take you out. This is God saying to us. So it was putting us in our place, really. And we're only there to benefit from what has already been laid down. And through the centuries, the Jews have made sure that through the scribes who've meticulously written the scriptures down so that they can never be said as well, especially when you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, which bear witness to the fact that there's nothing changed. You know, people say, oh, but that's an old book. You know, it's going to be changed. Chinese whispers and all of that, and how can it come down through the centuries and still be intact? Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls proves that it can be intact. And when I first read this, I went to my church, I went to different people. I said, look at this, isn't this amazing? I mean, my first church told me to go away. And that's what I did. I went to Israel for those 3 months. But I couldn't find anybody that had this same mindset or understanding. They just wouldn't look at it. And I think it's very sad that the church at large has actually missed a huge opportunity of seeing what God's heart and will and purpose is. And that, as you said, I'm sorry I'm rabbiting on a bit, I'm excited, okay, is that, you know, the Jews are coming back to Israel. So that Israel had to be there for them to come back to.
Exactly.
Let me ask you this as well, Zalmi. And so much, I didn't know this was all going to come up, so I'm so excited, really, you are obviously recognising me, but do you think that it is going to take the anti-Semitic actions that are taking place, like there was 2 Saturdays ago in America, where people are going to say, look, maybe we need to go back. We need to go, not back, because they themselves have never ever probably been to Israel, and say we need to go where we're going to be safe.
I have to say that this is a struggle which I'm facing right now. I had a discussion with my wife not so many weeks ago, against the background of Cabbie and against the background of, you know, of so many things that are going on in the world today, that I said to her, if my father was alive, my father died when I was 16. He had heart trouble from a disease, from an infection he had in the camps. But if he was alive today, he would be telling me off for staying in Britain and being out of Israel. He would say to me, you have everything you need in Israel. You have your people, you can observe your religion, you can walk around and practice as a Jew, your festivals and so forth. And, you know, you don't have to care about what anyone says. I can tell you now that I'm mixing with Israelis all the time, you know, almost, you know, every other month of the year. Do you think they care about what is said about them outside? Do you think they care about, they couldn't care less. Right. In fact, Israel was like 7th on the happiness index, a country surrounded by enemies, which has had a war every decade, okay, which is, you know, threatened by annihilation by Iran, and it's number 7 on the happiness index, way above Britain.
It's incredible.
Well, I can tell you now, Britain's nowhere near the happy index.
Exactly.
We're probably the most depressed, oppressed society on earth.
Yes.
It's quite shocking out there.
Yeah.
I'll come back to that point.
Now, can I just give you Amos 9:15?
Yeah.
I love this. Amos 9:15, the last verse. God speaking, I will plant them in their land.
My favourite verse.
It's not.
They will never be uprooted from the land. It's my favourite. You know, Amos was the most. He was the shortest of all of the prophets.
2 or 3 pages almost.
Yes,
yeah.
Exactly. He's got like a couple of chapters, but he has substance.
Nutshelled it.
And V'shavti eshvut ami Israel, right? That thing, and they will never be uprooted. And we will plant vineyards, and we will build cities, and we'll plant vineyards. Okay. This should be written on the walls of every single synagogue, because it is happening in front of our eyes. Yes. You know, whether it was in Gush Katif, we planted into sand, and, you know, tomatoes came out.
Yeah, it is amazing what Israel has done with its technology.
It is, and it says in Scripture. You know, being an Orthodox Jew, I'm an Old Testament man. Yeah. Okay, but I can tell you now that it is all happening.
It is, isn't it?
The famous tomato story. I mentioned tomatoes in Gush Katif, right? So they were growing tomatoes in Gush Katif. And there's a famous tomato award ceremony in the United States where the producers of tomatoes from all over the world come and they bring their produce and they give them the awards as to which is the best tomato. And it's a blind test. So nobody knows where it came from, Idaho, Spain, or wherever. Yeah. And of course, there's not a lot of mileage in saying Israeli tomatoes are the best because of the boycott, BDS, and so forth. But it was a Gush Katif tomato that won.
It says it all.
Exactly.
It says it all.
I better get through some of these. Leslie writes in, says, blessings. As Christians, we should love and pray for Israel and the Jewish people. Our Saviour, Jesus, in Hebrew, Yeshua, is the Messiah, and sometime in the future he shall return as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. We know that God has made a covenant with Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and he is the covenant-keeping God. Amen. Maranatha.
Amen.
Thank you, Leslie. Here we go. Satan hates the Jews. God loves the Jews. Christ lives in me, and it's so simply, it comes natural to love the Jews. Dead easy to work it out, really. Israel has contributed greatly to the betterment of the world in many ways, technology, etc. The world needs to recognize this fact and be grateful. Let's give the Jews their due. Shalom, says Jeff. Okay, that's very nice. Do you know, yeah, so I mean, how do you respond to when you hear something like that coming in such a positive way from a Christian?
I think basically, you know, we're joined in faith. At the end of the day, what is the Christian way? What is the Judeo-Christian way? Well, you know, it's to be a light unto the nations, really. You know, you think today, you look at Europe, and you see the problems of Europe. The main problems of Europe are, you know, the low birth rate. They've allowed, you know, the progressives have said, well, you know, we'll be professionals and we don't have to make children. And then there's the assault on the nuclear family and so forth, and that's not a great stuff. Well, in Judaism, and I'm sure in Christianity, the family is the center of life itself. So you have this, you know, the ungodly and the godly, right? So, you know, when I'm saying Trump is a man of faith, you know, he believes in the family and he believes in having kids. You know, I have to say to you, I'm not the greatest monarchist. You know, I read the Daily Mail, and it's like 5 pages of Meghan Markle and whatever every morning. Okay, I put up with it, okay? But I have to say, they're showing an amazing example. William and Harry and so forth, they're making babies. And the rest of the people are not. And as a result of that, Germany had to bring in, you know, millions of migrants because,
yes,
you know, you've got to have 2.1 live births per mother, per female. And if you drop below that, you can never recover from that. And most of Europe is...
Well, even China's finding that out,
exactly,
hasn't it, you know?
Exactly.
This is from Pete, says, great show tonight. In the story of Esther, an evil Persian called Haman plots the mass genocide of the Jews. However, the very instrument of death he wants to use on the Jews is instead turned on him. Isn't that something like being hoisted by your own petard? That was my words, by the way. The Bible is a prophetic book. Israel will attack Iran with the same nuclear bomb they are planning to use on the Jews. Well, we don't know that. That's End Time Pete, so...
Oh, that's End Time Pete, is it? Oh, that's Pete that came on with me a couple of years ago.
Right. Okay, yes, sorry. Thank you, Jeff, for your apology there on something. It was just a spelling thing, yeah. It's very hard when I'm dyslexic to read some of the people's writings, you know. I'm struggling enough just to read them when
I
they're
like the
right
story.
way.
I like the story, the man's mention of Esther.
Yeah. I was going to bring that up
one of my favourite stories. So, you know, we're seeing today almost a repetition of this. You know, you have Iran, and, you know, the story of Esther took place when, you know, the Iranian leader was had this evil advisor who persuaded him to...
something, Ahasuerus?
Ahasuerus, yeah.
Yes, Ahasuerus, yes. And he had an advisor who basically turned him into a raving anti-Semite.
Yeah.
And there's one famous line that says, the wife of Haman, you know, so Haman comes back, you know, and his fortunes are starting to fall now because, you know, the king's got wise to what he's up to.
Yeah.
And Esther's basically got the message saying, you know, this Haman guy, he's a bad dude, and he wants to go and kill all these Jews. And the king says, what? I didn't know about this. So he went home to his wife, Zeresh, and Zeresh says to him, Im mizera haYehudim Mordechai, if Mordechai, the Jew, if he is the son of, if he is of Jewish seed, nofol tipol lifneim, you will surely fall before him. And that's a lesson, unfortunately, that too many nations haven't learned. Because where are they all? You know, where are all the nations that persecuted the Jews in history? The Romans, the Greeks. Where are they now?
Absolutely. And do you know what, Hal? That with history repeating itself, the book of Ecclesiastes, I love this, 1:9, check this one out. That which has been is what will be. That which is done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. There are no surprises in what's happening now in the Middle East and in Israel and around the world. God said it, it's already happened. We've already had types and shadows, Esther, Haman. We've already had types and shadows, the Iranian situation. That which has been is that which has already been done.
Yes.
There's nothing new. And if your eyes are opened, then it's actually an exciting time to be alive, isn't it? I'm so grateful. I know I'm sitting here with you guys, but I'm so grateful that I'm just 49, you know, because I'm really hopeful that if I get a good few years on this earth, I'm going to see this amazing book be brought to pass, you know?
Yep.
I was having a conversation, I don't know whether it was actually with somebody who was sitting in the control room or it was somebody in the last few days talking about the book of Esther and really what an incredible book it is to read, to try, because if you want to start reading some of the Old Testament, that's one of my favourites. And the other one is Naomi and Ruth. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But these, when you look at what's happening today, people, if they knew what Esther in that book really talks about, they would understand that it's innate in that nation to hate the Jews, and it's almost like it's going to repeat itself again, because and then they would understand that we can't expect anything better from Iran than to want to see the Jews thrown into the sea and to be fully destroyed, like Haman had wanted, you know.
Well, I have to say to you, I have a theory that anti-Semitism has been our best friend of the Jews for years.
Because it's bringing them all back to Israel.
Can you imagine what would have happened if there was no anti-Semitism?
Mm. They would be prospering everywhere.
We would have been assimilated generations ago.
Right.
So true, yeah.
Mm. And this is the anti-Semitism. You know, if you're a religious person, I am, you are, then you believe that everything that's been created has been created by God and for a reason. Mm-hmm. Everything. Okay?
Absolutely.
So.
Yeah.
Anti-Semitism is such an illogical thing. Why on earth would the people of the world consistently, over the generations and from one continent to another, constantly single out the Jew, who is 1/10% of the population, for hatred? It is a totally illogical hatred. And it's got to have been created by God. Why would he do that? If you wanted to make sure that your kids, right, and there's an expression, 1,000 years in your eyes
is a day.
In our eyes is a day in your eyes.
Wow,
okay?
yeah.
So if you were a father and you went away for a week and you said, kids, I don't want you to go out of the playground.
Yeah.
Okay? And I want to find you here when I get back. Okay? So if you go 5,000 years,
yeah,
okay, and you expect to see your kids there, the only way you're going to see those kids there is if other people have not taken them into their hearts and so forth. They're still there. And we're still here. Mm-hmm. And not only are we still here after 5,000 years, but we have recreated our language in our land.
Yeah. Which is unheard of.
Which is unheard of. It's never happened in history.
I would like to go one better than saying, if you like, that God introduced anti-Semitism, if I may. So, in the sense that when I see Scripture and understand that, for example, this Scripture, I was just trying to write the notes down when you were talking, what our enemy means to harm us, God will turn around for our good. And when you think of Satan, right from the very beginning, he wanted to cause a problem between Ishmael and Isaac, and the division there as they parted, the two groups, the Arab and the Jew. And what better way to do that is to cause division in every way possible. And it's an evil thing, anti-Semitism. It's not just something that's a human invention, you know. I think it's beyond that.
This is a very deep evil.
Absolutely. So, and I think what God has done, he's allowed that to flourish for the reasons, probably, what he, as his word promises, what your enemy means to your harm, God will maneuver to make it for your benefit. Yeah. I've seen that several times in Scripture at different times. And I mean, even the way some of the enemies, I'm trying to remember what the time was. It was probably around the Davidic time, when, or even somewhere in that 1,000-year, from there to the 1,000-year BC, yep. where the enemies of Israel always wanted to actually cause a problem, and God has allowed it to fester and manifest to the extent where God has done something, maneuvered. Like, for example, who was it when the prophet, was it Elijah, who was standing on the battlements of when the Israelites were surrounded?
Yeah, and did he pray for him to open his eyes?
Yes, because there were more for them
than against.
Even though there was hundreds of Syrians or whatever it was.
Yep.
They were, the people were afraid in that, yes. in that city, but God opened their eyes, yes. and he saw that the
hordes backed up.
Yeah, I mean, many occasions like that, and even played out in modern history of Israel, like at the time of 47, 48, where the Arabs surrounded you. You know, you had so few ways in which to defend yourself, and yet you came through. Yeah. Yes. I mean, against all the odds.
Yes.
And I think, again, it's when the enemy comes against the Jews, or even in our own lives, we've seen that as Christians, God will maneuver things so that you come out on top. And I think he's done that every time for the Jewish people, for such a time as this.
He did.
Very true.
How the Lord saw in Genesis 16, 11 and 12, the family feud.
Yes.
Far down the road. Mm-hmm. Behold, you are with child, you shall bear a son, you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. Verse 12, this is amazing. He shall be a wild man. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all of his brethren. The Lord saw this coming. Mm-hmm. You know? Yeah. It's,
well, Sarah meant good.
Yes.
She ran ahead of God, didn't she, by giving Hagar to Abraham.
And we're all prone to do that, aren't we? Yeah. When we run out of our patience, we try and put God on our timetable, don't we?
Yeah.
We do it all the time. I spend my whole life putting God on my timetable. Yeah. And he's finally shown me.
Yeah. Shalom. I'm fascinated by hearing and having you on the show today. It's really good. I'm not being very good with reading out everybody's emails. So, okay. Shalom. Why is the star in the Israel flag?
It's the Star of David.
Yeah.
The Shield of David.
Yeah. And when did it get, I mean, how, historically speaking, when did it become discovered that was in the Star of David, you know, historically?
Well, I mean, Israel is replete with archaeological digs, and you only have to go down to, if your correspondent and your emailer gets on a plane, it's not expensive, go to Israel, go to Jerusalem, and go to the excavations of David's city. And the City of David excavations, you will be fascinated by what is being dug up there. Fascinated.
Zalmi, is it true that is it in the Kidron Valley, the Arabs, the Waqf, isn't it? They're destroying the Jewish artifacts, smashing them to pieces, basically, trying to get rid of any remaining vestiges of it.
Unfortunately, in '67, when we took over Jerusalem and recaptured Jerusalem, Moshe Dayan, the defense minister, gave the keys to the Temple Mount and the whole area to the Waqf, which is the Arab authority, which is controlled by Jordan. And they started demolishing as much of the Jewish heritage as possible. They said they were building stables or some other things, the mosques and so forth, but what they were really doing is they were excavating and they were pulverizing any vestige, because their aim is to erase Jewish history. Yeah. Because that is the greatest threat to them, is Jewish history. And so they took these big bulldozers and they emptied them out into the car park. And Israeli archaeologists went into the car park, stole all this dirt, and sifted through it and found the most incredible treasure trove of things. But politically, they couldn't stop the Waqf, couldn't take the keys back. Yeah. Do you know what, Zalmi, that's very interesting. That was they're trying to replace history, aren't they? Yes, it's and ironically now, with what's happening in Europe, we've not got a history replacement programme, although we have up to a point. We've got a people replacement programme in Europe now. This is what's happening. They are denying the past, changing it, and It's called post-history.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah, replacement theology. Yes. I mean, look, the Arabs themselves. I mean, you know, the Islam says that it wasn't Isaac who was on the altar. It was Ishmael. It's a whole rewriting of everything.
Yeah. Can I ask you to read for me, because I'm not
sure, pass it over.
doing too well with my dyslexia tonight. So you know how to work that
I've got it,
page, yeah.
Right, here we go. Good evening. It's interesting what you said in that the more extreme Muslims only occupied 15 to 20% of Muslims. The West, who are or were in the majority as Christians at the end of the last war, similarly seem to have been subjected by their ensuing minority leaders, who are controlled by the UN and the IMF, who are forcing a secular, godless agenda down the throats of the masses by calling it democracy and using the human rights agenda, which in fact takes the rights away from the majority of Christians. This is where freedom morphs into communism of the worst kind. Israel, under Judaism, appears to be under the same threat from the UN as are the Christians, but more directly obvious through the media bias. Shalom from Brian.
Yes, I mean, this is...
No, keep
work
your way through them.
It's very true. Progressivism is, you know, they call it progressivism, but it's actually regressivism.
Yeah.
It's, you know, it's confining humanity to the scrap heap. You know, if you're not making families, you're not making babies. You know, where's your future? And that's what they're up to.
A couple of things that you mentioned earlier, and it comes up, and I know that in the general media, people look at Zionism in a bad way. They've got a poor understanding what it really means. That's my estimation. Would you enlighten us as to what a Zionist is?
A Zionist is a person who believes in the return of the Jews to their natural homeland, to their biblical homeland, the ingathering of the exiles to their natural homeland. We have to understand that the anti-Semitism that you've been talking about from generations, from the time of Esther to we're talking about thousands of years, okay? The Jews are the most hunted, the most persecuted and most hunted species in the history of mankind, in the history of the world. And if you compare that to the animal kingdom, what happens when you have a hunted species, a white rhino, right? You need a game reserve. Israel is a game reserve.
Yeah.
And we have to protect it as such.
Yeah.
And there's no shortage of poachers.
Yeah. Yeah, makes sense.
I was reading this week that there's a red heifer. Is this true?
This comes up every 5 or 6 years. Yeah.
But is there genuinely one? That's why I sort of was a bit dubious about what I was reading, because I mean we need a red heifer to be there to signify the end of days, don't we?
Yes.
The restoration of the temple.
You know, we see miracles in Israel, and those of us who go there, you know, we see absolute miracles. I mean, there is, you know your Bible, you know that there is, every 7th year, there is what's called a Shemitah year, right? That you're not supposed to plant and reap your field.
Oh, yes, that's right. It should fallow.
You allow the land to go fallow.
Yeah.
And for those who keep that 7th year, because, you know, if you ask a farmer, you say, you know what, for 1 year, nothing. What's he going to live off of? God says, don't worry, I will repay you double in the 6th year so that you will have for the 7th year. Okay. So I went up to Shiloh, and which is the site of where the tabernacle came from the wilderness. Before the temple was built, there was the tabernacle. That's where the Ark of the Covenant was, and the resting place of it was Shiloh. It's a lovely place, and it's being restored lovingly. And I went to the Shiloh winery, and I went to buy some crates of wine, and I spoke to the winemaker there, and I asked him. I said, "Tell me, does this thing really work in the 6th year? Because I mean, you know, to order twice as many barrels, you know, you have to be a bit of an entrepreneur to take that kind of a risk, right? You have to plan ahead." He says, "You can bank on it." Oh, I said, "Really?"
Fantastic.
He says, It never, ever fails. The 6th year, I get twice the amount of the crop. Now go, you explain that. Go and explain that to an unbelieving person.
Again, these are the things that when I first read the scriptures, there were several things like this, and the Jubilee year and other things like letting the field go fallow was something which I think I mean, going back to when I was a very young child, I was brought up on a farm, and the farmers did follow that principle. But over recent years, I don't know how long ago it is, that they just don't do that. So it's over-farmed. The land doesn't give us its best for the crop, and we're not getting the nutrition that we should be getting from it because we've over-farmed. Yes. And we've neglected that. And I'm thinking, you know, if they could go back to biblical principles, we would prosper more, and not just financially, but also in our health and our well-being. And there's another thing that I really thought was fantastic. God's way of dealing with things, I think, is so fair. You know, in politics today, it gets a bit muddy with trying to be fair to those that are poor and those that are wealthy, and you know, and finding a middle road that everybody benefits. Okay, and I love the principle of the poor being able to glean from the fields. You know, that was, you know, the principle to me there was that somebody in the village, if they were allowed to come out at the end of the day and they would glean from the fields, the farmer couldn't take everything. But it meant that that person had to get off their backside, with all due respect, unless they were crippled, and go and work to get the gleaned benefits. Okay, and that it meant also that the farmer was making provision for the poor. It spoke of God's heart, and I saw the same with the Jubilee. If your family, your inheritance, you know, for your next generation, the next generation was the land you were given, as it was when the 12 tribes were all allotted their land. So even if somebody in your family was a rogue, or they'd misspent and got the family into trouble, you know, and in debt, God had made a provision that on the 49th year, that whatever it was, that all that property came back to the next generation. Yes. It was so lovely. And today you struggle. I mean, the governments don't quite get this. This is my own little crib here, is that we have nothing left to give our children, and they don't see that, and it's almost, the governments are ignoring the fact that you want to tax us to death. But I mean, really, if they could let us live a less stressful life in trying to provide for our children when we're gone, and our grandchildren, so that they've got something to inherit. And I love that whole principle there of the Jubilee year. It has nothing to do with the Queen. Yeah. It's got nothing to do with it. It's to do with the people, that they were able to carry on to the next generation with their family, their farm, their house, or whatever their property was. And again, this was what I loved when I read the scriptures.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah. Do you know, Howard, you talking about the gleaning situation with the farmer's field, and Zalmi with the 7th year, the Shemitah, and putting away double in the 6th year, and God turns up miraculously in the 7th. That's really, I mean, I could be sitting at home here just enjoying this, because that spoke to my heart. I'm in a work situation in about 3 years' time where I possibly won't have any work, you know, because of certain things. And already my overactive brain and my heart is worrying. I'm putting myself in 3 years' time. But, you know, you guys are just speaking from the scriptures, speaking to my heart. You know, our God, he knows our needs before we even voice them, and he's got them already sorted out. Wouldn't it be lovely if we could be born with the wisdom that we glean through the years and not worry in the first place, you know? It's
well, this is something...
Gleaning from the fields that you mentioned.
Yeah.
That came from the story of Ruth.
Yes.
And last Friday night, I was standing at the grave of Ruth.
No, really, my
It's in Hebron.
Yeah.
And Jesse and Ruth. Jesse is her husband. And, you know...
Because she married...
I must take you one day to Hebron to see these amazing places.
Yeah, I've been there several times, but do you know, it saddens me that when I see the division again between the Jew and the Arab and the animosity, you can feel it. It's thick in the air. And you go there and you go through, there's a special entrance. The Arabs have their entrance to Abraham.
Yes.
Yeah, and the tomb there. And the Jews separate. And it's just, you can almost feel like it's thick in the air with the spirit of like dissension, resentment, everything. It comes out.
Although I have to say that what you're talking about is that the cave of Machpelah, which is the burial place of the patriarchs, is now a mosque. The Arabs had this for many years, and before the '67 war and before we liberated it, but they built a mosque over it, and now that's divided between an Israeli, a Jewish synagogue, and a mosque. So Isaac and Rebecca, I think, are in are in the mosque section, and Abraham and Sarah are in the Jewish section. But by agreement, and this is how the cooperation goes, by agreement, on the festivals and on last Sabbath, which is that special one that I mentioned, the mosque is vacated, and the Jews have the whole of the mosque. So there is coexistence. There are arrangements there, and in Hebron, Arab Hebron is controlled pretty much by Arab clans, and they pretty much cooperate on the basis that they want economic, viability. So they play the game well. But unfortunately, down in Gaza, it's a little bit more Wild West. Exactly.
Yeah. Wow.
What do you think of this scripture? For me, it's very encouraging when I read this. Isaiah chapter 20, is it? 19, beg your pardon. And it's saying in verse 19, he says, "In that day there will be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar to the Lord near its border. And it will become a sign and a witness to the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt. For they will cry to the Lord because of oppressors, and he will send them a saviour and a champion, and he will deliver them. Thus the Lord will make himself known to Egypt, and the Egyptians will know the Lord in that day, and they will even worship with sacrifice and offering, and will make a vow to the Lord and perform it. For the Lord will strike Egypt, striking but healing, so they will return to the Lord, and he will respond to them and will heal them. And in that day there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria, and all the Assyrians will come into Egypt, and the Egyptians into Assyria, and the Egyptians will worship with the Assyrians. And in that day, Israel to be a third party with Egypt, and Assyria a blessing in the midst of the earth, whom the Lord of hosts has blessed, saying, Blessed is Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance." What?
Very inspiring stuff.
Isn't it? I'm glad you see that as well, because I just wonder, sometimes you read these things and you think, God has a plan to bring reconciliation, but it's going to come in his time.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's going to be when the eyes of understanding and the people are blinded at the moment. I mean, you couldn't talk to a politician about this, I don't think. No. They would never really understand.
In the natural mindset, speaking from my flesh, those set of scriptures seem utterly impossible to come to pass.
Yeah.
Utterly impossible. But we know that because of all the rest, we know the Lord has got it sorted.
Yes, but I mean, you talk about impossible. One of my favourite sayings is that coincidence is just God trying to stay in the background. That
yes, he's a gentleman.
Coincidence is God trying to stay anonymous.
Yeah.
But his hand is always there.
Yeah.
You are seeing this. You are seeing this on a pretty much daily basis.
We're almost at the end of time, so we'll read a few.
Okay, wow.
Because it's a shame that I'm so eager to just read people's emails and texts, but I'm learning and I'm enjoying this conversation. So thank you so much.
We could do 2 hours on this one, couldn't we, Hal? Yeah, definitely. What a fantastic programme. God bless you and your guest this evening. Jesus has put it on my heart to love Israel and the Jewish people. I so long to go to Israel and pray. and I pray I will go this year. Shalom, Lynn from South Wales. God bless you, Lynn.
Wow.
Got one here from Maggie. Dear gents, I've been a supporter of Rev TV for many years now, and I've always stuck up for Israel's right to be in her own land again. I even made a sticker for my car which says Ezekiel 11:17, which is, therefore say, thus says the Lord God, I will gather you from the peoples, assemble you from the countries where you've been scattered, and I will give you the land of Israel. A few years ago, while tracing my family tree, I noticed there were a lot of Jewish names on my mother's side. I put this down to the Victorian custom of giving their children biblical names, and I forgot about it. A couple of years ago, just on a whim, I got my DNA tested and found that I had 33% Jewish DNA. I know it sounds cowardly, but instinctively I'm very careful who I tell. I know people sometimes can be anti-Semitic. It's such a shame. Maybe I should go and live in Israel.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Everyone is welcome, you know, to see it for themselves. You know, seeing is believing. And you know, there used to be a T-shirt that said, Israel is real. And it's never been more true than it is today.
Yeah.
Another one. We've got time for that.
Hang on a second. You took me by surprise there.
Oh, sorry, buddy. Oh, OK. Yeah. Go on.
I can't pronounce that word. That's a bit of a tough one.
That's why I gave it to
even for me. You know, Howard, you can have this back. that word's off the charts. Hi, Howard. The Jews will always triumph. Their very survival is testimony to God's love for them. Anybody who opposes them is on a course for disaster. The only thing we learn from history is that we don't learn from history, and that is from Jeff. How true is that?
Very good, Jeff.
Yes.
Yeah, it's true. And that's the Ecclesiastes 1:9 verse that's just popped in my head, just to confirm that one. Yeah.
Got one more short one?
Right, one here, quick one from Dave. This is for you, Zalmi. Hi, folks. As we Christians believe in Jesus and the New Testament, we believe there will be a new earth. Where in the Old Testament does it say there will be a new earth? As I assume the Jews believe there will be a new earth. Is that right or wrong? And that's from Dave.
Isaiah?
Yes, I think basically a new earth, you know, could mean physically a new earth or a new way of thinking. And I think basically we can see where the world is going right now, and if it's brought back to its senses, that would be a new earth.
And the New Jerusalem is
And a new Jerusalem, yes.
mentioned there as coming down to heaven.
Yes.
Amazing stuff.
Yeah.
How long we got? How would we close?
Zalmi, thank you very much for being with us. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as what we have, you know. We have a couple more minutes. I don't know, you squeeze another one in there as well.
Keep speaking just while I read the next one.
And I just want to say to our viewers, thank you so much for being patient with us tonight, because normally I would read all your emails and we get 100 to 150, and I'm sorry that I haven't got even anywhere near that tonight. I apologise.
Got one here from Joyce. In days to come, Jacob will take root, Israel will bud and blossom, which it already is, and fill all the world with fruit. From Joyce. It already is, isn't it?
Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful.
I mean, I would like to just say share with your viewers a thought that I always have, and I tell it to bar mitzvah boys. I say, you know, you're growing up, you're 13 years old, you're growing up, and you're going to face anti-Semitism, and you're going to be bullied, and you're going to be kicked and ridiculed and so forth. You have to understand something. Everything that we deal with, you know, in our life today, you know, the wind in your face, the fire in the hearth, the light of the sun. Okay, these are ordinary things we take for granted, and they don't harm us. Okay, but if you take water and you put it under pressure, you can create a water cannon, and if you heat it up, you can run a steam locomotive from the steam with that kind of power. If you take ordinary light from the sun, but you concentrate it under enormous pressure, you create a laser which will cut through steel. So our people have been persecuted over all the generations. They've been put under the most incredible pressure. But it is only because we have been put under that pressure that we have been able to be the knife that goes through butter, that goes through 5,000 years of history and winds up home, in our language, with our own people and our own customs, living the way we were supposed to live and living the way the Bible says that we should be living.
Wow. Correct me if I'm wrong, Zalmi. I think
Okay.
it was...
Sorry,
go on.
I say we're out of time. But that reminds me, Zalmi, of the refiner's fire, okay? And it has a good ending, and that's where you get the pure gold when we go through persecution. Thank you very much, Mark and Zalmi, for being with us, and also for all our viewers. And we apologise that we didn't get to everything But stay tuned to Revelation TV to learn more about Israel. God bless you. Thank you.